Cargo pilot vanished in 2007. 18 years later, Drought reveals his plane at the bottom of a drying lake. Cracked mud stretched endlessly under the September sun as Park Ranger Maria Delacroix's boot struck twisted metal beneath the hard pan. Lake Meredith, northern New Mexico. September 15th, 2025. 9:47 a.m. The drought had been merciless this year, worse than anything in the historical records. Water levels had dropped to 30% capacity, exposing sections of lakebed that hadn't seen daylight since the Kennedy administration. Maria knelt beside the metallic object, brushing away layers of dried sediment with her gloved hands. The aluminum was corroded, but unmistakably aircraft grade, with remnants of blue and white paint still clinging to the surface. Her radio crackled. "Delacroix, you copy? We've got hikers reporting debris in Sector 7. Maria keyed her response while studying the twisted metal fragment. "Copy that, dispatch. Already on scene in Sector 7. We've got what looks like aircraft wreckage." The morning air carried the smell of exposed lake bottom, a mixture of rotting vegetation and mineral deposits that reminded Maria of low tide at the ocean. She had worked at state parks for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the secrets that drought could reveal. The debris field extended across 50 yards of cracked earth, pieces of an aircraft scattered like breadcrumbs leading toward the center of the former lake. Her pulse quickened as she spotted larger sections of fuselage protruding from the dried mud. This wasn't just debris from a small crash. This was an entire airplane that had been sleeping beneath Lake Meredith for years, maybe decades. Maria stood and surveyed the wreckage field, noting the impact pattern and the way the heaviest pieces had settled. The plane had hit the water hard, but maintained some structural integrity. She pulled out her camera and began documenting the scene, taking wide shots of the debris pattern before moving closer to photograph individual components. A section of wing displayed partial registration numbers. The paint faded, but still legible. N847DS. Maria wrote the numbers in her field notebook, her handwriting cramped but careful. Aircraft registration numbers were like fingerprints. They would tell her exactly which plane this was and who had owned it. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the exposed lakebed. Maria's radio buzzed with chatter from dispatch, coordinating with the sheriff's department and requesting a forensics team. Standard protocol for any potential crash site, though this one came with the complication of being underwater for an unknown number of years. She walked the perimeter of the debris field, noting how the pieces were distributed. The heaviest components, including what appeared to be the engine block, lay closest to the impact point. Lighter materials had scattered further, carried by underwater currents before settling into the lake bottom sediment. What kind of airplane lay buried beneath Lake Meredith, and how long had it been there? The call came at 7:23 a.m., jolting Detective Ray Hutchins from his first decent sleep in weeks. Albuquerque Police Department, Major Crimes Unit, September 16th, 2025. Captain Torres's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "We need you at Lake Meredith. State Parks found what looks like a small aircraft, completely submerged until this drought hit." Hutchins rubbed his eyes and reached for the notebook he kept on his nightstand, a habit developed over 23 years of law enforcement. Morning calls usually meant someone's worst day was about to become his problem. "Any idea how long it's been down there?" Hutchins asked, already calculating the drive time to the lake. "That's what we need to find out. NTSB is sending an investigator, but they want local law enforcement on scene first. Could be a crime scene." The drive north took Hutchins through high desert country that seemed unchanged since the territory days. Trading posts and roadside diners dotted Highway 550, their neon signs promising cold beer and green chile that could raise the dead. Lake Meredith had never been a major tourist destination, just a modest reservoir that served the scattered ranching communities and provided decent fishing when the water levels cooperated. Park Ranger Delacroix met him at the makeshift perimeter they had established around the crash site. She was younger than he had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of outdoor work in harsh conditions. Her uniform was crisp despite the early hour, and her field notebook showed the careful documentation of someone who understood that details mattered. "Aircraft is a Cessna 208 Caravan," Delacroix said, consulting her notes. "Single-engine cargo plane. The registration numbers are still partially visible on what's left of the starboard wing." Hutchins studied the wreckage through his binoculars, noting the way the aircraft lay on its belly in the dried mud. The nose pointed toward the deepest part of the former lake, suggesting the pilot had been trying to reach the center when impact occurred. The relatively intact fuselage meant the pilot might have maintained some control during the descent, possibly attempting a water landing rather than an uncontrolled crash. "Any sign of human remains?" he asked, though he suspected the answer based on 18 years of experience with aviation accidents. Delacroix shook her head. "Nothing visible from the surface. We're waiting for your authorization before we start any excavation work." The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the exposed lakebed that reminded Hutchins of crime scene photos. He made notes about wind direction, terrain features, and the position of the wreckage relative to the original shoreline. Standard procedure for any potential crime scene, though this one came with the unique challenge of nearly 2 decades of lake bottom between the incident and the investigation. His phone buzzed with a text message from the NTSB investigator. "ETA 1400 hours. Do not disturb scene until arrival." Hutchins pocketed the phone and continued his preliminary assessment, walking the perimeter of the debris field while Delacroix provided details about the discovery timeline. The Cessna 208 was a workhorse aircraft, popular with cargo operators and charter services throughout the Southwest. It could carry substantial loads into remote airstrips that larger aircraft couldn't access. But Lake Meredith wasn't an airstrip. It was 40 miles from the nearest airport, surrounded by high desert terrain that offered few emergency landing options. What had brought this cargo plane down in the middle of a remote New Mexico lake, and why had no one reported it missing? The tail number led them to a ghost company and a mechanic who remembered everything. Desert Sky Aviation, Gallup, New Mexico. September 17th, 2025, 2:15 p.m. NTSB investigator Sarah Blackwood sat in her rental car outside the abandoned offices, studying the peeling paint and broken windows that marked another casualty of the 2008 recession. The aircraft registration database had given them their first solid lead, N847DS, a 2003 Cessna 208 Caravan registered to Desert Sky Aviation until the company dissolved in bankruptcy. She knocked on the front door anyway, more from investigative habit than hope. The building had the hollow echo of long abandonment, but movement across the tarmac caught her attention. "You looking for Jimmy Martinez?" The voice belonged to an elderly man in coveralls, his face deeply lined from decades of desert sun and aircraft fuel. Oil stains marked his hands like permanent tattoos, and his walk carried the careful balance of someone who had spent a lifetime working around spinning propellers. Blackwood introduced herself and explained about the aircraft discovery at Lake Meredith. The mechanic, Pete Sandoval, listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to bad news about airplanes and the people who flew them. "That Caravan belonged to David Kellerman," Pete said, settling onto a makeshift bench made from an old wing section. "Best pilot Jimmy ever had. Flew medical supply runs mostly. Some general cargo when the clinic contracts were slow." The afternoon wind picked up, scattering tumbleweeds across the empty runway and rattling loose hangar doors. Blackwood pulled out her notebook, feeling the familiar quickening that came with a case beginning to take shape. After 18 years underwater, David Kellerman was becoming a real person instead of just a name on aircraft registration documents. Pete's memory proved surprisingly detailed for events nearly 2 decades old. Kellerman had been reliable, professional, and careful about aircraft maintenance. He flew the Durango medical run twice weekly, carrying insulin and emergency medications to rural clinics that served the scattered ranching communities of southwestern Colorado. David was worried about something those last few weeks, Pete said, his weathered hands working absently at a bolt that had long since seized. Kept asking questions about flight planning software, alternate routes, that sort of thing. Not like him to overthink a routine run. The revelation hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Blackwood made careful notes about Kellerman's behavior changes, while Pete described the pilot's growing unease in the weeks before his disappearance. The medical supply runs had become more frequent, the cargo loads heavier, and the pressure from desert sky management more intense. Jimmy Martinez was always pushing for faster turnarounds, Pete continued. More flights, bigger loads, tighter schedules. The profit margins on those medical contracts were thin, but the volume made up for it. What had David Kellerman discovered about his medical supply runs that made him change his careful flying habits? Elena Kellerman opened the door with the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting this conversation for 18 years. Albuquerque, September 18th, 2025, 10:30 a.m. The single-story house sat on a quiet street lined with mature cottonwoods, their leaves already showing autumn gold despite the lingering heat. Detective Hutchins introduced himself and Blackwood while studying Elena's face for signs of recognition or fear. He found neither, only a deep exhaustion that seemed carved into her features by years of unanswered questions. "Mrs. Kellerman, we're investigating your husband's disappearance," Hutchins said. "We found his aircraft in Lake Meredith yesterday." Elena nodded and stepped aside to let them sit down, her movements careful and deliberate. The living room was neat but sparse, dominated by a bookshelf filled with aviation magazines and flight training manuals. A framed photograph on the side table showed a smiling man in a pilot's uniform standing beside a white and blue Cessna, the same aircraft now resting in the dried mud of a New Mexico lake. "I wondered when someone would finally come," Elena said, settling into a worn armchair that faced the front window. David disappeared on October 12th, 2007. He was supposed to fly medical supplies to a clinic in Durango, Colorado. The afternoon light streaming through gauze curtains gave the room an ethereal quality, like a waiting area suspended between hope and acceptance. Blackwood noted the absence of recent photographs, as if Elena had stopped documenting her life the day her husband vanished. "Did you report him missing?" Blackwood asked gently. Elena's laugh carried no humor. "I tried everything. The police said adults have the right to disappear. Desert Sky Aviation claimed David never showed up for work that day, that he had probably stolen the airplane and run off with another woman." The accusation hung in the quiet room like an old injury. Hutchins studied Elena's face while she recounted her futile attempts to find answers. Jimmy Martinez, Desert Sky's owner, had been particularly cruel in his suggestions about David's character and motivations. "He told me David had gambling debts, that he was probably selling medical supplies on the black market," Elena continued. "Said I should be grateful David hadn't involved me in whatever scheme he was running." But Elena knew her husband better than the aviation company owner who had profited from his work. David Kellerman was methodical, responsible, and deeply committed to the medical supply runs that served isolated communities. He understood that diabetic patients could die without their insulin shipments, that emergency medications meant the difference between life and death in places where the nearest hospital was hours away. "David kept detailed flight logs at home," Elena said, rising to retrieve a leather-bound logbook from the bookshelf. He recorded everything: weather conditions, fuel consumption, cargo manifests, even notes about patients he met at the clinics. The logbook told a different story than the one Jimmy Martinez had constructed. David's entries showed increasing concern about cargo discrepancies and unusual requests from clinic administrators. His handwriting, normally precise, became hurried in the final weeks before his disappearance. What had David Kellerman discovered in his cargo holds that made him question the medical supply operation he had trusted? The flight logs revealed a pattern of increasing cargo loads and mounting pressure from unexpected sources. Elena Kellerman's kitchen table, September 18th, 2025, 2:45 p.m. Blackwood spread David's logbooks across the worn Formica surface, while Elena prepared coffee with the automatic movements of long-established routine. The pilot's entries painted a picture of a man growing increasingly uncomfortable with changes to his normally straightforward medical supply runs. September 15th, 2007. Cargo manifest doesn't match actual load. Clinic requesting double insulin shipment. No explanation for increased patient census. September 22nd, 2007. MedCorp Solutions driver seemed nervous during loading. Boxes heavier than manifest indicates. Jimmy pushing for faster turnarounds. October 5th, 2007. Clinic administrator Dr. Voss not available for delivery confirmation. Security guard signed for $47,000 shipment. Unusual for such high-value cargo. Detective Hutchins traced David's increasingly urgent notations with his finger, noting how the careful pilot's documentation became more detailed as his concerns grew. The final entry, dated October 11th, 2007, carried an ominous tone that made Elena's coffee cup rattle against its saucer. Route change requested by MedCorp for tomorrow's flight. New coordinates provided. Jimmy says client confidentiality prevents disclosure of reasons. Elena sat heavily in her kitchen chair, her eyes fixed on her husband's handwriting. David called me that night. Said he was worried about the medical supply contracts, that something wasn't right about the increased shipments. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, while Blackwood photographed relevant pages from the logbook. David Kellerman had been a methodical record keeper, documenting not just flight data, but cargo details that revealed troubling inconsistencies in the medical supply operation. He mentioned Dr. Voss by name. Elena continued, said she had been asking strange questions about flight schedules and delivery routes. David thought someone was using the medical shipments to cover something else. The revelation transformed their investigation from a simple aviation accident into something more complex and potentially criminal. Hutchins made notes about the pharmaceutical company, MedCorp Solutions, and the mysterious route changes that had preceded David's final flight. Elena retrieved a manila folder from a kitchen drawer, her movements careful but determined. David kept copies of everything: cargo manifests, delivery confirmations, even photographs he took at some of the more remote clinics. The photographs showed David standing beside his aircraft at isolated airstrips, smiling broadly while clinic staff unloaded medical supplies. But the final images, taken in early October 2007, revealed a different story. The clinic staff looked nervous, hurried, and David's smile had vanished entirely. What had David Kellerman photographed in those final medical supply runs that cost him his life? The clinic had burned to the ground 3 months after David Kellerman's disappearance, taking its secrets with it into ash and smoke. Animas Valley, New Mexico. September 19th, 2025, 11:15 a.m. Detective Hutchins stood in the vacant lot where the Animas Valley Medical Clinic once operated, reading from a faded fire marshal's report on his tablet. The official cause was listed as electrical fire, but investigating Marshal Teresa Quintana had noted several troubling inconsistencies in her final assessment. The sprinkler system had been mysteriously disabled the week before the blaze. Security cameras had been out of order for maintenance. The fire had burned unusually hot for a simple electrical fault, consuming medical records and pharmaceutical storage areas with suspicious thoroughness. Blackwood knelt beside the remaining concrete foundation blocks, brushing away years of accumulated sand and tumbleweed debris. Scorch marks still darkened the cement, visible after 17 years of desert weathering. The pattern suggested accelerant use, though the original investigation had been cursory at best. "Convenient timing," she said, photographing the burn patterns with her phone. "Destroy all evidence of what medications they were actually ordering and dispensing." The autumn wind swept across the empty valley, carrying the scent of sage and distant moisture from approaching storm clouds. This had never been prime real estate for a medical facility. The nearest town was 15 miles away, accessible only by washboard dirt roads that became impassable during heavy rains. The patient population couldn't have justified the expensive medical equipment and large pharmaceutical inventories that David's flight logs had documented. Hutchins walked the perimeter of the burned foundation, noting how the fire had been most intense in areas that would have housed medical records and drug storage. The adjacent staff parking area showed remnants of melted asphalt, suggesting vehicles had been present during the blaze and possibly used to remove materials before the flames took hold. "This wasn't a rural clinic," he said, studying satellite imagery of the area from 2007. "Look at the size of this foundation. They had loading docks, refrigerated storage, security fencing, more like a pharmaceutical distribution center." The revelation reshaped their understanding of David Kellerman's final flight. He hadn't been delivering medical supplies to a small rural clinic. He had been unknowingly supporting a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that used legitimate medical supply routes to mask illegal pharmaceutical distribution. Elena's description of her husband's growing concerns now made perfect sense. David had been documenting evidence of a criminal enterprise without realizing the danger his meticulous record-keeping represented to people willing to murder for secrecy. But the fire had been too late to silence the pilot who had already vanished into the depths of Lake Meredith. Who had ordered David Kellerman's death, and how had they lured him to his final destination? Dr. Margaret Voss lived in a fortress of guilt and unopened prescription bottles, her medical license suspended and her memories poisoned by 18 years of silence. Farmington, New Mexico, September 19th, 2025, 4:30 p.m. The former clinic director answered her door with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. Her house was small and sterile, decorated with the kind of impersonal furniture that suggested frequent moves and few permanent attachments. Medical journals stacked on every surface suggested continuing education for a practice she could no longer legally maintain. Blackwood settled into an uncomfortable wooden chair while Hutchins studied the woman's hands, noting the slight tremor that suggested either medication, side effects, or chronic anxiety. Dr. Voss poured coffee with movements that were too precise, too controlled, like someone afraid of revealing nervousness through spilled liquid. "I wondered if anyone would ever ask about David Kellerman," she said, settling across from them with a cup she didn't drink. "I've been expecting this conversation for 18 years." The admission hung in the afternoon air like a confession waiting to unfold. Dr. Voss stared into her untouched coffee while recounting the medical supply operation that had destroyed her career and possibly cost a pilot his life. The Animas Valley Medical Clinic had been designed as a legitimate rural healthcare facility, funded by state grants and federal rural medicine initiatives. "We were supposed to help people," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of professional failure. "Diabetic patients who couldn't afford insulin, elderly ranchers who needed cardiac medications, children with asthma in communities too small for full-service pharmacies." but legitimate medical need had been overwhelmed by criminal opportunity. MedCorp Solutions, their pharmaceutical supplier, had gradually increased shipment sizes and frequencies beyond anything justified by actual patient census. Dr. Voss found herself signing for medications she hadn't ordered, treating patients who existed only on fraudulent insurance claims, and participating in a prescription drug diversion scheme that generated millions in illegal profits. "David started asking questions in September," she said, finally meeting Blackwood's eyes. "He wanted to know why we needed so much insulin for a clinic that served maybe 50 diabetic patients. Smart man. Observant. Too observant." The coffee grew cold while Dr. Voss described the pressure she had faced from MedCorp administrators and shadowy partners who visited the clinic after hours. The legitimate medical supplies were real, but they comprised less than 20% of each shipment David delivered. The remainder consisted of diverted prescription drugs destined for black market distribution throughout the Southwest. "They told me David was asking too many questions," she whispered. "Said he needed to be transferred to different routes or convinced to stop documenting cargo discrepancies." But David Kellerman's methodical nature had made him impossible to deceive or relocate. His flight logs contained evidence of systematic pharmaceutical fraud that could destroy the entire operation and send its organizers to federal prison for decades. What ultimatum had MedCorp Solutions delivered to ensure David Kellerman's silence? The flight path deviation told the story of a pilot who knew he was flying toward death, but chose to gather evidence instead of running. Federal Aviation Administration Regional Office, Denver, September 20th, 2025, 2 p.m. Air traffic controller Marcus Webb pulled up radar data from October 12, 2007, his fingers moving across a keyboard that had archived 18 years of digital flight tracking. The bureaucracy of aviation generated endless records, most of them forgotten until investigations like this one demanded answers from electronic memories. "Your pilot filed a standard flight plan from Gallup to Durango," Webb said, pointing to the green line traced across his monitor. "But the actual radar track shows significant deviation from the approved route." Blackwood leaned closer to study the flight path reconstruction. David Kellerman's aircraft had followed the normal route for approximately 30 minutes before turning sharply north toward Lake Meredith, well outside any reasonable corridor for emergency landing sites or weather avoidance maneuvers. The deviation had been deliberate and sustained. Kellerman maintained steady altitude and airspeed while flying toward coordinates that matched no airports, landing strips, or navigation beacons in the region. He had been following someone's specific instructions, possibly delivered through radio channels not monitored by air traffic control. "Any communication from the pilot about the course change?" Hutchins asked, studying the timeline displayed on Webb's screen. "Last radio contact at 14:47 hours, reporting normal flight conditions and maintaining filed altitude," Webb replied. After that, complete radio silence until radar contact was lost at 15:23 hours. The 36-minute gap between last communication and disappearance represented the crucial window when David Kellerman had flown knowingly toward his death. His decision to deviate from the approved flight path suggested either coercion through radio threats or a desperate attempt to gather final evidence about the pharmaceutical trafficking operation. Webb enhanced the radar display to show terrain features around Lake Meredith. The area was mountainous and isolated, with no legitimate reason for a cargo pilot to fly there during a routine medical supply run. But it offered perfect concealment for activities that required absolute secrecy. Ground speed remained consistent until the final radar sweep, Webb noted, highlighting the aircraft's performance data. No indication of mechanical problems or emergency conditions. This was controlled flight into terrain. The phrase carried ominous implications for investigators familiar with aviation terminology. Controlled flight into terrain typically resulted from pilot error, spatial disorientation, or deliberate action. Given the circumstances surrounding David's investigation of pharmaceutical fraud, deliberate action seemed most likely. But had David Kellerman flown to Lake Meredith as a victim, or as an investigator determined to document evidence with his final flight? The federal courthouse steps became a battlefield between justice seekers and corporate defense attorneys armed with procedural delays. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico, October 15th, 2025, 8:45 a.m. Marcus Brennan emerged from a black sedan wearing a $1,000 suit and the confident expression of a man who had purchased his way out of trouble before. His legal team formed a protective barrier as reporters shouted questions about MedCorp's role in David Kellerman's murder and the systematic killing of pilots who had threatened their pharmaceutical trafficking empire. Detective Hutchins watched from across the plaza, noting how Brennan's demeanor differed from typical defendants facing murder charges. The MedCorp president walked with the assured stride of someone who believed money could overcome evidence, that corporate respectability trumped criminal accountability. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and impending rain, weather that matched the somber mood of Elena Kellerman and the other victims' families gathered for the arraignment. 18 years of waiting had led to this moment when the justice system would finally acknowledge the murders hidden within legitimate pharmaceutical operations. Federal prosecutor Amanda Sterling stepped up to the microphone positioned at the courthouse entrance, her briefcase containing evidence that could destroy MedCorp's criminal empire or disappear into procedural challenges that might delay justice for years. Today we begin holding accountable those who turned rural medical needs into profit centers built on murder, Sterling announced, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. David Kellerman and 4 other pilots died because they asked too many questions about cargo that was supposed to save lives. But Brennan's defense attorney immediately approached the microphone with objections that suggested this prosecution would face every legal obstacle that money could purchase. The corporate protection that had shielded MedCorp for decades wouldn't surrender easily to David's posthumous evidence. Would the federal courts prove strong enough to convict executives who had perfected the art of hiding murder behind medical respectability? The pharmaceutical evidence told a story of contaminated medications that had killed patients while generating illegal profits. DEA Forensic Laboratory, Phoenix, Arizona, October 18th, 2025, 2:30 p.m. Special Agent Park studied the laboratory analysis of medications recovered from MedCorp facilities, each test result revealing another layer of criminal negligence that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. The diverted pharmaceuticals weren't just stolen property. They were contaminated, expired, and adulterated substances that had been sold to desperate patients as life-saving treatments. Laboratory technician Robert Chen placed slides under the microscope while explaining the systematic contamination found in insulin shipments that MedCorp had diverted from legitimate medical facilities. The medications showed evidence of improper storage, bacterial contamination, and chemical degradation that rendered them not just useless, but actively dangerous to diabetic patients. These insulin samples would have caused infections, organ damage, potentially death, Chen said, adjusting the microscope focus to reveal bacterial colonies growing in what should have been sterile medication. MedCorp wasn't just stealing drugs, they were poisoning people. The revelation transformed their understanding of the criminal enterprise that had killed David Kellerman. MedCorp's executives hadn't just trafficked prescription medications. They had knowingly distributed contaminated pharmaceuticals to rural patients who couldn't afford alternatives, turning medical desperation into profit while causing deaths that were never connected to their criminal operations. Park reviewed patient medical records from clinics that had received MedCorp shipments during the company's most active trafficking years. The mortality statistics were devastating when viewed collectively. diabetic patients in rural New Mexico had died at rates significantly higher than national averages, often from complications that suggested medication contamination rather than disease progression. David Kellerman was trying to stop this, she said, photographing laboratory results that would support additional murder charges against MedCorp executives. He probably realized people were dying from contaminated medications he was unknowingly delivering. The scope of MedCorp's criminal negligence extended across 3 states and potentially hundreds of victims who had died from medications that were supposed to heal them. David's investigation had uncovered not just pharmaceutical trafficking, but a systematic poisoning of rural communities that relied on legitimate medical supply chains. But proving the connection between contaminated medications and patient deaths would require medical evidence that MedCorp had spent years concealing through intimidation and murder. How many patients had died from MedCorp's contaminated pharmaceuticals, and could federal prosecutors prove corporate executives knew their products were killing people? The Witness Protection Program couldn't shield Dr. Margaret Voss from nightmares about patients who had died from medications she had knowingly distributed. Federal Safe House, location classified. October 20th, 2025, 11:15 a.m. Dr. Voss sat across from Prosecutor Amanda Sterling in a sterile conference room that could have been located anywhere in the continental United States. The walls were beige, the furniture was government standard, and the windows were covered with security film that prevented anyone from seeing inside or outside. Her testimony would be crucial for convicting MedCorp executives, but 18 years of guilt had transformed the former clinic director into a fragile witness whose credibility would face savage attacks from defense attorneys representing corporate interests worth millions of dollars. "I need you to understand what you're facing," Sterling said, reviewing notes that outlined the defense strategy MedCorp's legal team would employ against Dr. Voss's testimony. "They're going to argue you're an unreliable witness seeking reduced sentencing through false accusations." The afternoon light filtering through secured windows cast shadows across medical journals that Dr. Voss still read despite having lost her medical license years earlier. She understood pharmaceutical interactions, contamination risks, and patient mortality patterns better than most practicing physicians. But her complicity in MedCorp's criminal operations made her both the prosecution's best witness and most vulnerable target. "The patients trusted me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Diabetic children, elderly ranchers, pregnant women who needed medication to survive. I signed death certificates for people killed by drugs I helped distribute." Sterling studied the psychological evaluation that federal marshals had commissioned before placing Dr. Voss in witness protection. The former clinic director suffered from severe depression, survivor guilt, and alcohol dependency that had developed during her years of forced silence about MedCorp's criminal operations. Her medical expertise would be essential for explaining how contaminated pharmaceuticals caused patient deaths that appeared to result from natural disease progression. But her emotional fragility made her vulnerable to cross-examination tactics designed to destroy witness credibility through psychological manipulation. The prosecution's case depended heavily on Dr. Voss's testimony about pharmaceutical contamination and patient mortality patterns. If MedCorp's defense attorneys succeeded in discrediting her witness testimony, corporate executives responsible for multiple murders might escape justice through legal technicalities. Could Dr. Margaret Voss survive the witness stand long enough to deliver testimony that would convict the executives who had forced her complicity in their deadly pharmaceutical trafficking empire? The defense strategy emerged through leaked documents that revealed MedCorp's plan to blame dead pilots for crimes committed by living executives. Law offices of Morrison, Bradley and Associates, Phoenix, Arizona. October 22, 2025, 4:45 p.m. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison spread confidential documents across her conference table while explaining to her client how character assassination could overcome evidence of systematic murder. The leaked strategy memo outlined plans to portray David Kellerman and other dead pilots as criminal conspirators who had stolen pharmaceuticals for personal profit. Marcus Brennan listened with the cold attention of someone accustomed to purchasing favorable outcomes through expensive legal representation. His defense team had constructed a narrative that transformed victims into villains, evidence into coincidence, and corporate murder into individual criminal enterprise. "We argue the pilots were running their own trafficking operation," Morrison explained, pointing to fabricated financial records that suggested David had received payments from unknown sources. Kellerman discovered our client's legitimate pharmaceutical distribution operation and tried to extort money through false accusations. The fabricated evidence was sophisticated enough to confuse jurors unfamiliar with aviation procedures and pharmaceutical distribution protocols. Defense investigators had constructed bank accounts, forged communications, and manufactured witness statements that portrayed David as a criminal mastermind rather than an honest pilot who had died for asking too many questions. Brennan studied photographs of David's family that defense investigators had obtained through private surveillance of Elena and their adult daughter. The images would be used to suggest domestic problems that might have motivated David to steal pharmaceuticals and abandon his family rather than face criminal prosecution. "The widow's grief makes her an unreliable witness," Morrison continued, reviewing psychological profiles that defense experts had prepared to attack Elena's credibility. 18 years of believing her husband was murdered has created false memories and conspiracy theories that support prosecution claims. But the defense strategy contained a fatal flaw that its architects hadn't anticipated. David's meticulous documentation had been so thorough that fabricated evidence would be easy to disprove through forensic accounting and timeline analysis. The corporate executives who had ordered multiple murders now faced the possibility that their expensive legal defense might not overcome the posthumous investigation conducted by a pilot they had underestimated. Would MedCorp's character assassination strategy succeed in transforming their murder victims into criminal scapegoats? Or would David Kellerman's evidence prove stronger than corporate lies? The media circus threatened to overwhelm the prosecution's carefully constructed case with sensational coverage that prioritized entertainment over justice. Channel 7, News Studio, Albuquerque, New Mexico. October 25, 2025, 6 p.m. Television reporter Jessica Martinez faced the camera with the kind of dramatic expression that suggested breaking news rather than routine legal proceedings. Behind her, graphics proclaimed, "Cargo Pilot Murder Mystery," in fonts designed to capture viewer attention rather than convey accurate information about complex pharmaceutical trafficking operations. The news coverage had transformed David Kellerman's murder into entertainment content that emphasized sensational speculation over factual evidence. Television producers preferred conspiracy theories to corporate crime, mysterious disappearances to systematic pharmaceutical contamination that had killed vulnerable patients. Elena watched the broadcast from her living room, feeling violated by reporters who had turned her husband's death into content designed to generate advertising revenue. The media attention brought unwanted scrutiny to her family while potentially compromising the prosecution's ability to present evidence without sensational distraction. New evidence suggests the missing cargo pilot may have been involved in a sophisticated drug trafficking operation, Martinez announced, reading from teleprompter text that reflected defense talking points rather than verified information. Sources close to the investigation question whether David Kellerman was victim or criminal mastermind. The television coverage repeated defense claims about David's alleged criminal activities while ignoring evidence of MedCorp's systematic murder of pilots who had threatened their pharmaceutical trafficking empire. Media outlets found corporate corruption less compelling than individual criminality, complex evidence less interesting than simple conspiracy theories. Federal prosecutor Amanda Sterling watched the broadcast with growing concern about its potential impact on jury selection and public perception of the case. Potential jurors were being exposed to defense propaganda disguised as news coverage, creating prejudicial attitudes that might prevent fair evaluation of evidence during trial proceedings. The media circus was achieving exactly what MedCorp's defense team had intended. Public attention was shifting from corporate accountability to speculation about David's character, from systematic pharmaceutical contamination to individual pilot criminality. But Elena Kellerman refused to let television coverage destroy her husband's reputation or obscure the justice he had died seeking for contaminated medication victims. Could the prosecution overcome media sensationalism and defense propaganda to present evidence that would convict the corporate executives responsible for multiple murders? The courtroom gallery filled with families whose loved ones had died from contaminated medications, their presence a silent indictment of corporate greed disguised as legitimate business. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico, November 4th, 2025, 9 a.m. Elena Kellerman sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her hands folded in her lap as she watched Marcus Brennan enter the courtroom with his expensive legal team. 18 years of waiting had led to this moment when the justice system would finally confront the executives who had turned rural medical needs into a murder-for-profit enterprise. Federal prosecutor Amanda Sterling arranged evidence folders on the prosecution table while studying the jury that would decide whether corporate executives could be held accountable for ordering the deaths of pilots who had threatened their pharmaceutical trafficking operation. The 12 jurors represented a cross-section of New Mexico communities, people who understood rural healthcare challenges and the vulnerability of patients who depended on legitimate medical supply chains. Judge Patricia Reyes called the court to order with the gravity appropriate for a case involving systematic murder disguised as corporate operations. Her courtroom had hosted numerous white-collar prosecutions, but none involving the deliberate contamination of life-saving medications distributed to desperate patients in isolated communities. Sterling rose to deliver her opening statement, knowing that the next few minutes would frame the jury's understanding of evidence that spanned nearly 2 decades of corporate criminality. The prosecution's case would succeed or fail based on its ability to connect David Kellerman's meticulous documentation to a pattern of pharmaceutical contamination that had killed vulnerable patients throughout the Southwest. David Kellerman died because he discovered that the medical supplies he was delivering were poisoning the people they were supposed to heal, Sterling began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The defendants ordered his murder not to protect trade secrets, but to conceal evidence of systematic pharmaceutical contamination that generated millions in illegal profits. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense as Sterling outlined evidence that would prove MedCorp executives had knowingly distributed contaminated medications while eliminating witnesses who threatened to expose their deadly operations. But defense attorney Catherine Morrison sat confidently at the defendant's table, prepared to attack the prosecution's case through character assassination and procedural challenges designed to confuse rather than clarify. Would the federal justice system prove strong enough to convict corporate executives who had perfected the art of hiding murder behind medical respectability? Dr. Margaret Voss took the witness stand, carrying 18 years of guilt and the prosecution's hopes for convicting corporate executives who had forced her complicity in pharmaceutical murder. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico. November 6, 2025, 2:15 p.m. The former clinic director's hands trembled slightly as she placed her palm on the Bible for oath administration, her voice barely audible as she swore to tell the truth about medical operations that had killed patients she had sworn to protect. Federal marshals positioned throughout the courtroom reflected the serious security concerns surrounding a witness whose testimony could destroy MedCorp's criminal empire or expose her own vulnerability to corporate retaliation. Prosecutor Sterling approached the witness stand with careful steps, knowing that Dr. Voss's fragile emotional state required gentle handling to extract testimony that would convict executives responsible for multiple murders. The former clinic director understood pharmaceutical contamination better than most practicing physicians, but her complicity in MedCorp's operations made her both the prosecution's best witness and most vulnerable target for defense attacks. Dr. Voss, please tell the jury about the medications that MedCorp delivered to your clinic between 2005 and 2007, Sterling said, her tone designed to encourage rather than intimidate a witness whose credibility would face savage assault from defense attorneys representing corporate interests worth millions of dollars. The afternoon light streaming through courtroom windows caught dust motes dancing above the jury box as Dr. Voss began describing pharmaceutical shipments that contained contaminated insulin, expired antibiotics, and adulterated medications that had been stored improperly to maximize MedCorp's profit margins. Her medical expertise provided detailed explanations of how bacterial contamination caused infections that appeared to result from natural disease progression rather than criminal negligence. The insulin samples showed bacterial colonies that would have caused organ damage, potentially death, in diabetic patients, she said, her voice growing stronger as professional training overcame personal anxiety. MedCorp executives knew their storage methods were contaminating medications, but they continued shipping them because proper refrigeration would have reduced profit margins. Defense attorney Morrison prepared for cross-examination that would attack Dr. Voss's credibility through psychological manipulation designed to destroy witness testimony through emotional breakdown rather than factual contradiction. The defense strategy depended on transforming the prosecution's expert witness into an unreliable narrator whose guilt had created false memories of corporate criminal operations. But Dr. Voss's medical knowledge provided specific details about pharmaceutical contamination that would be difficult to dismiss through character assassination alone. Could the former clinic director survive cross-examination long enough to deliver testimony that would convict the executives who had forced her participation in their deadly pharmaceutical trafficking empire? The defense cross-examination transformed the courtroom into a psychological battlefield where Dr. Margaret Voss faced questions designed to destroy her credibility rather than establish truth. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico, November 7, 2025, 10:30 a.m. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison approached the witness stand with predatory confidence, her expensive suit and calculated demeanor designed to intimidate a witness whose testimony threatened corporate executives accustomed to purchasing favorable legal outcomes through expensive representation. The packed courtroom gallery watched with tense anticipation as the prosecution's key witness prepared to face questions crafted to destroy rather than illuminate. Dr. Voss gripped the witness stand railing with white knuckles as Morrison began her assault on 18 years of suppressed guilt and alcohol dependency that had developed during the former clinic director's forced silence about MedCorp's criminal operations. The defense attorney had studied psychological evaluations and medical records to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited to discredit witness testimony. Dr. Voss, isn't it true that you lost your medical license due to prescription drug abuse? Morrison asked, her tone designed to suggest that addiction had compromised the witness's ability to distinguish between reality and false memories created by years of guilt and depression. The question struck Dr. Voss like a physical blow, her face flushing with shame as Morrison displayed medical records documenting substance abuse treatment and psychological counseling that had followed her involvement in MedCorp's pharmaceutical trafficking operations. The defense strategy was clear: transform the prosecution's expert witness into an unreliable narrator whose credibility had been destroyed by personal problems rather than corporate criminal complicity. But Prosecutor Sterling objected immediately, arguing that Dr. Voss's medical knowledge remained intact despite personal struggles that had resulted from forced participation in criminal activities she had tried unsuccessfully to stop. The judge sustained the objection, but the damage to witness credibility was already evident in several jurors' expressions of doubt and concern. Morrison continued her psychological assault with questions about Dr. Voss's alcohol consumption, financial difficulties, and social isolation that had developed during years of carrying secrets about pharmaceutical contamination that had killed vulnerable patients throughout rural New Mexico. Each question was designed to suggest that guilt and substance abuse had created false memories of corporate criminality. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Dr. Voss struggled to maintain composure under questioning designed to trigger emotional breakdown rather than establish factual accuracy. Her medical expertise provided detailed testimony about pharmaceutical contamination, but her personal vulnerabilities made her susceptible to defense tactics that prioritized witness destruction over truth discovery. Would Dr. Margaret Voss survive the defense cross-examination that threatened to destroy the prosecution's case through psychological manipulation rather than evidence contradiction? The jury deliberated for 37 hours while Elena Kellerman sat in the courthouse cafeteria, stirring coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico, November 12, 2025, 3:45 p.m. The extended deliberation suggested either thorough consideration of complex evidence or fundamental disagreement about corporate accountability for pharmaceutical murders that had been disguised as legitimate business operations. Elena studied the faces of other victims' families who had maintained their vigil throughout the trial, their expressions reflecting the same mixture of hope and exhaustion that had sustained her through 18 years of seeking justice. Prosecutor Amanda Sterling paced the courthouse corridors with nervous energy that betrayed her professional confidence about the strength of evidence against MedCorp executives. Dr. Margaret Voss's testimony had survived the defense cross-examination, but jury reactions had been difficult to interpret during questioning that revealed both pharmaceutical expertise and personal vulnerabilities that complicated witness credibility. Detective Hutchins sat beside Elena, reviewing case files that had consumed months of investigation, but might prove insufficient to convince 12 jurors that corporate executives had ordered systematic murder to protect illegal profits from contaminated medication distribution. The evidence was overwhelming to law enforcement professionals, but civilian jurors might struggle to accept that respectable businessmen were capable of such calculated evil. The courthouse clock ticked steadily toward evening, while defense attorney Catherine Morrison displayed confident optimism that suggested either genuine belief in her client's innocence or professional performance designed to maintain corporate morale during uncertain circumstances. Marcus Brennan and his fellow executives waited in a private conference room, their expensive suits and calm demeanor suggesting men accustomed to purchasing favorable outcomes through legal manipulation. Elena's daughter Sarah arrived from Colorado, her presence providing emotional support that had been missing during the lonely years when David's disappearance had been dismissed as abandonment rather than murder. The family reunion carried bittersweet undertones, bringing together survivors who had rebuilt their lives around a void that justice might finally acknowledge. The late afternoon light streaming through courthouse windows cast long shadows across the marble floors, where victims' families had waited for accountability that might never come. Corporate defendants had resources to appeal adverse verdicts through years of procedural delays that could outlast the determination of grieving survivors seeking closure. But Elena Kellerman refused to consider defeat when victory had seemed impossible for 18 years. Would the jury find sufficient courage to convict corporate executives whose crimes had been hidden behind medical respectability and pharmaceutical legitimacy? The verdict came at 4:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, delivered by a jury foreman whose voice trembled with the weight of holding corporate executives accountable for systematic murder. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico. November 12, 2025, 4:17 p.m. Marcus Brennan's confident expression crumbled as the foreman read guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, pharmaceutical trafficking, and criminal negligence resulting in death. His fellow MedCorp executives received similar convictions that would result in life sentences without possibility of parole, justice that had arrived 18 years late, but with devastating finality. Elena Kellerman closed her eyes and felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the judge accepted jury verdicts that vindicated her husband's memory and acknowledged the systematic crimes that had destroyed multiple families throughout the Southwest. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from victims' families who had waited years for accountability that many had believed would never come. Defense attorney Morrison immediately announced plans for appeals that would challenge evidence admissibility and jury instruction procedures, legal maneuvers designed to delay justice through procedural obstacles that might exhaust prosecution resources and family determination. But the unanimous guilty verdicts suggested evidence too overwhelming for appellate courts to overturn without compromising public confidence in judicial integrity. Judge Patricia Reyes scheduled sentencing hearings that would allow victim impact statements from families whose loved ones had died from contaminated medications distributed through MedCorp's criminal enterprise. The proceedings would provide formal acknowledgement of suffering that corporate executives had dismissed as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of illegal profits. Dr. Margaret Voss wept openly in the witness gallery, her testimony having survived defense attacks designed to destroy rather than challenge evidence of pharmaceutical contamination that had killed vulnerable patients. Her cooperation with federal prosecutors would result in reduced sentencing, but personal guilt would continue punishing her participation in crimes she had been too frightened to stop. The courthouse steps filled with news media reporting verdicts that represented rare success in prosecuting corporate executives for criminal activities disguised as legitimate business operations. Television coverage focused on dramatic courtroom moments rather than systematic pharmaceutical contamination that had killed patients throughout rural communities with limited healthcare resources. But Elena Kellerman ignored media attention while embracing her daughter and remembering her husband's dedication to delivering life-saving medications to isolated communities that depended on pilots like David, who had died protecting patients from corporate greed disguised as medical necessity. Could federal sentencing guidelines provide punishment severe enough to deter other corporate executives from committing systematic murder in pursuit of pharmaceutical trafficking profits? The sentencing hearing transformed Marcus Brennan from corporate executive to convicted murderer facing life imprisonment without hope of freedom. United States District Court, Albuquerque, New Mexico, December 15, 2025, 10 a.m. Judge Patricia Reyes studied pre-sentencing reports that documented the full scope of MedCorp's criminal enterprise: $47 million in illegal profits, contaminated medications distributed to over 300 rural clinics, and patient mortality rates that exceeded national averages by devastating margins. The systematic nature of pharmaceutical trafficking operations had resulted in deaths that numbered in the hundreds, making this case one of the largest corporate murder prosecutions in federal history. Elena Kellerman approached the podium to deliver victim impact testimony that would help determine whether Brennan deserved any possibility of eventual parole consideration. Her prepared statement had been revised dozens of times, but standing before the judge who would decide her husband's killer's fate, she spoke from the heart about 18 years of unanswered questions and systematic injustice. David died because he cared more about diabetic children than pharmaceutical profits, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Marcus Brennan ordered his murder to protect contaminated medications that were poisoning the patients my husband thought he was helping to heal. The defendant showed no visible emotion as Elena described how David's investigation had revealed pharmaceutical contamination that killed vulnerable patients while generating millions in illegal profits for corporate executives who viewed human lives as acceptable business expenses. Brennan's expensive suit and confident demeanor had been replaced by prison clothing and the defeated posture of someone facing permanent incarceration. Additional victim impact statements came from families whose loved ones had died from contaminated insulin, expired antibiotics, and adulterated medications that MedCorp had knowingly distributed to maximize profit margins. Each testimony revealed another dimension of corporate criminality that had transformed rural medical needs into opportunities for systematic pharmaceutical murder. Judge Reyes delivered sentences that reflected the unprecedented scope of MedCorp's criminal operations. Life imprisonment without parole for Brennan and his fellow executives, financial restitution that would require liquidation of all corporate assets, and victim compensation funds that might provide some measure of justice for families destroyed by pharmaceutical trafficking disguised as legitimate medical operations. The gavel fell with finality that closed a case spanning nearly 2 decades, but Elena Kellerman's victory carried the bittersweet knowledge that justice could never restore the family that corporate greed had destroyed. Would federal sentences severe enough to deter other pharmaceutical executives from committing systematic murder in pursuit of illegal profits generated through contaminated medication distribution? The David Kellerman Aviation Safety Act passed Congress 18 months after his killers received life sentences, but Elena wondered if legislative victory could prevent other families from losing pilots to corporate greed. United States Capitol Building, Washington, D.C. June 8, 2027, 2:30 p.m. Elena stood in the Senate gallery watching lawmakers debate federal regulations that would require enhanced oversight of pharmaceutical transportation contracts and mandatory reporting of cargo discrepancies that pilots discovered during medical supply operations. The legislation bore her husband's name, transforming his murder into a framework designed to protect other aviators from corporate retaliation when they questioned suspicious shipments. Senator Patricia Martinez of New Mexico had championed the bill through committee hearings that exposed systematic gaps in aviation oversight that had allowed MedCorp's criminal enterprise to operate without detection for nearly a decade. The proposed regulations would create whistleblower protections for pilots who reported pharmaceutical irregularities and establish federal penalties for companies that retaliated against employees who documented cargo discrepancies. But Elena understood that legislative solutions couldn't address the fundamental problem of corporate executives who valued profits over human lives. The MedCorp convictions had sent a strong message about federal prosecution capabilities, yet pharmaceutical trafficking continued throughout the Southwest under different company names and more sophisticated concealment methods. Detective Hutchins joined her in the gallery, his presence representing law enforcement support for aviation safety measures that might prevent future investigations into murdered pilots whose only crime had been asking too many questions about suspicious cargo loads. His case files contained evidence of other pharmaceutical trafficking operations that had learned from MedCorp's mistakes while maintaining the same deadly disregard for patient safety and pilot welfare. The Senate vote was unanimous, 98-0, with 2 senators absent due to family emergencies. The legislation would proceed to the House of Representatives, where pharmaceutical industry lobbyists waited with arguments about regulatory burden and compliance costs that ignored the human consequences of inadequate oversight. Elena watched the electronic vote tally appear on the chamber's display screens while remembering David's meticulous flight logs that had provided evidence for convicting corporate murderers 18 years after his death. His dedication to documentation had saved other pilots' lives by exposing systematic criminality, but legislative protection remained theoretical until enforcement proved effective against determined corporate criminals. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the Capitol's windows illuminated dust motes dancing above the Senate floor, where lawmakers celebrated passage of aviation safety legislation that might honor David Kellerman's memory through practical protection for future pilots who discovered evidence of pharmaceutical trafficking disguised as legitimate medical operations. Would federal regulations prove strong enough to deter corporate executives from ordering the murders of pilots who threatened illegal profits through honest reporting of cargo discrepancies? Lake Meredith had refilled during the winter rains, its waters once again concealing the impact site where David Kellerman's aircraft had rested for 18 years. Elena visited the shoreline every October 12th, the anniversary of her husband's final flight, carrying flowers that she scattered across waters that had finally surrendered their secrets to drought and justice. The pharmaceutical industry had implemented new tracking systems and oversight protocols designed to prevent the kind of systematic contamination that had killed vulnerable patients throughout the Southwest. But Elena understood that corporate compliance depended on enforcement mechanisms that required constant vigilance from regulators who faced pressure from industry lobbyists seeking reduced oversight. Dr. Margaret Voss had completed her federal prison sentence and relocated to Vermont, where she worked at a rural clinic that served low-income patients with legitimate medical needs. Her testimony had been crucial for convicting MedCorp executives, and her cooperation with ongoing pharmaceutical trafficking investigations continued protecting other communities from contaminated medication distribution. The aviation industry had embraced enhanced cargo reporting requirements and whistleblower protections that encouraged pilots to document suspicious shipments without fearing corporate retaliation. David's legacy lived on through federal regulations that bore his name and protected other aviators from the kind of systematic intimidation that had cost him his life. Elena had established a scholarship fund that provided flight training for students interested in medical aviation careers, ensuring that David's commitment to serving isolated communities would inspire future pilots who understood the critical importance of legitimate medical supply operations. The scholarships honored his memory while preparing new aviators to continue the essential work he had died protecting. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across Lake Meredith's restored waters, a reminder that some secrets surface only when conditions align to reveal truths that have been hidden for too long. David Kellerman's investigation had taken 18 years to achieve justice, but his meticulous documentation had ultimately convicted the corporate executives who had ordered his murder to protect illegal profits from pharmaceutical trafficking operations. His final flight had ended in tragedy, but his posthumous victory had saved countless lives through regulations that protected both pilots and patients from corporate criminals who viewed human suffering as acceptable business expense. The lake that had concealed his aircraft now reflected afternoon clouds that reminded Elena of her husband's enduring commitment to serving communities that depended on honest pilots delivering life-saving medications to people who had nowhere else to turn. Justice had arrived 18 years late, but David Kellerman's legacy would protect future generations from the kind of systematic pharmaceutical murder that had been disguised as legitimate medical operations until Drought revealed the evidence that convicted his killers and honored his memory through lasting aviation safety reform.